The sun slipped behind the jagged mountains west of Phoenix, its final rays stretching low and agonizingly long across the parched Sonoran Desert, a land that had seen eons pass in a blink. As the daylight surrendered, shadows grew long and distorted among the towering saguaro cactus, painting the ancient earth in dusky, bruised bands of violet and molten gold. The oppressive heat, which had baked the valley for hours, shimmered from the rocks for a few lingering moments before finally fading into the cooling, expectant hush of evening. The desert, sprawling and ancient, seemed to exhale quietly as the day came to its weary end. A warm, dry breeze stirred the copper dust, whispering secrets across dry creek beds and through the low, gnarled mesquite trees that dotted the landscape like silent observers. Somewhere far off in the darkness, the lonely call of a coyote echoed once against the canyon walls and then ceased, leaving a silence so heavy it felt tangible. Above, the sky bloomed into a majestic gradient of soft indigo, deepening into a velvet black as the stars began to appear one by one, like tiny lanterns flickering to life in a vast, overhead cathedral. They spread outward in every direction, sharp and clear, unhindered by cloud or haze, making the sky feel both impossibly close and infinitely distant at once. In the outskirts of Phoenix, where the homes nestled against the low, scrub-covered hills, people settled into the slow rhythm of a Thursday evening in March. An older couple, Arthur and Martha, sat on their weathered porch with tall glasses of iced tea, watching the sky slowly deepen in color, the ice clinking softly against the glass. They didn't speak much, as the silence between them was comfortable, filled only with the slow, rhythmic hum of cicadas and the occasional whisper of the desert wind. Arthur leaned forward to light a small citronella candle, its tiny flame flickering as the last of the natural light dimmed around them. Farther south in the quiet town of Maricopa, a young boy named Leo lay on the hood of his father's rusted truck, his eyes fixed on the constellations he had learned in school that week. His dad, a tall man in dusty work boots who smelled of grease and hard labor, leaned back beside him, quietly correcting the star names with a tired but proud smile. "That one's Orion," he said, pointing a calloused finger toward the glittering belt that hung like a diamond buckle in the sky. Leo nodded, his eyes wide with wonder, the vastness of the night sky reflected perfectly in his pupils. At this hour, the desert felt both immense and intimate, a place where time seemed to move slower and the air itself carried stories older than any town or road. There was no rush here, for the land had witnessed generations come and go, always returning to its final state of silence. Up north near Prescott, a family took a slow walk along a gravel road that curved gently between fields of brush and prickly pear. The mother looked up often, scanning the stars while her children chased each other ahead in the fading light. Her husband carried a heavy flashlight he never turned on, for there was enough light from the celestial dome above to guide their way. The starlight was sharp and pale as bone. Elsewhere across the state, from Flagstaff to Tucson, the same sense of stillness unfolded as telescopes were adjusted on backyard tripods and lawn chairs creaked under the weight of quiet observers. The faint glow of distant towns sat low on the horizon, a reminder of life continuing, but doing so gently and softly in the face of the infinite. There was a comfort in that silence, a kind of ancient calm that wrapped around the land like a protective blanket. But beneath this calm, something subtle was shifting. Somewhere deep beneath the tranquility, a low-frequency hum began to vibrate, a sensation so faint it was felt in the marrow rather than heard. It was the kind of feeling that causes one to glance up without knowing why, a sudden prickle of intuition on the back of the neck. Dogs across the valley paused at their fence lines, their ears perked toward the northwest. An owl, usually a master of the silent hunt, flew low over a field with its wings wide, suddenly agitated. A driver on a quiet, two-lane highway slowed his vehicle for a moment, unsure what he had seen out of the corner of his eye, thinking it was nothing, only the play of light and shadow, but the heavens were watching in return. A glint, high and faint, appeared just over the ridge to the northwest. It wasn't bright or dramatic, it was just present, too still to be a conventional plane and too steady to be a wandering star. It hung there almost unnoticed, as if deciding whether it truly wanted to be seen. Then a second glimmer joined it, then a third, and finally a fourth and fifth, forming a tight, geometric arrangement. As the formation began to move, it revealed itself as a vast, triangular shape, a shadow so immense it blotted out entire constellations as it glided southward. Along its underside, a string of soft, yellow-orange lights glowed steadily, spaced with a precision that looked like lanterns hung carefully along the keel of a great, celestial ship. The object drifted slowly, deliberately, as though moving to a rhythm only it could hear, its edges blending seamlessly into the velvet night. Across the cities and desert towns, witnesses paused in their daily activities. A couple walking their dog in Prescott stopped mid-step, heads tipped back to catch sight of the silent visitor. Children playing in a Phoenix backyard fell quiet, mesmerized by the vast craft above. Even pilots flying routine evening routes adjusted their courses, their eyes scanning the instruments in disbelief as they remarked on the strange, soundless presence moving beneath the stars. Despite its colossal size, covering several city blocks and measuring as long as multiple football fields, the craft made no noise, no engine hummed, no rotor whirred. There was only a vast and profound stillness that wrapped the night in an aura unlike any other. The city of Phoenix seemed to collectively pause, bound together by this shared, unspoken moment beneath the vast desert sky. The stars behind the craft flickered softly, their light dimmed by the shadow it cast, despite the presence of thousands of observers beneath it. The city's usual clamor, the hum of traffic, the distant bark of dogs, faded into a hushed reverence. Minutes stretched and folded as the craft drifted slowly, lingering above the city with a steady, peaceful presence. It moved without disturbance, almost as if it were part. Chapter 2. In the late autumn of 1988, the world felt significantly larger and more disconnected than it does today, and the night sky over the American heartland was a vast, lonely frontier for those traveling through the dark. Harold Vance was a man defined by weary habits, a mid-level insurance adjuster whose life was measured in actuarial tables, claims forms, and the rhythmic thrum of long-distance business travel. On a bitter November night, he boarded Flight 412, a commercial red-eye from San Francisco to Chicago. The aircraft, a seasoned Boeing jet, hissed with the familiar, recycled smell of stale coffee, industrial upholstery cleaner, and the faint, lingering scent of tobacco from the recently banned smoking sections. The cabin was bathed in a sickly dim yellow light that flickered occasionally as the plane taxied across the rain-slicked tarmac. Harold, seeking only the mercy of a few hours of sleep before his morning meetings, found his seat at the very back of the aircraft, seat 33A, a window position tucked against the vibrating rear bulkhead where the roar of the engines was a constant, dull ache. As the flight reached its cruising altitude, the interior of the cabin settled into a heavy, artificial twilight. Most of the passengers were slumped in their seats, their faces obscured by the shadows or the soft, focused glow of overhead reading lamps. The only sounds were the steady, white noise drone of the turbines and the occasional rustle of a newspaper or the clink of a plastic cup from a restless traveler. Harold leaned his forehead against the cold, vibrating plexiglass of the window, watching the distant, scattered lights of small towns passing miles below like embers in a dying fire. He was halfway over the Pacific, or so the flight map suggested, when the cabin lights dimmed for the night, leaving the world outside as nothing but clouds and a black, featureless ocean. He was reading a dog-eared paperback, trying to distract himself from the discomfort of the cramped row, when he noticed something strange outside the window. At first, he thought it was a star reflecting on the glass, but it was too close, far too close. A light appeared, moving alongside the plane and matched perfectly to its speed. It was a glowing sphere, dull orange in color, looking like heated metal that had been pulled from a forge. It didn't blink like a navigation light. Instead, it pulsed gently, as if it were breathing in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere. As Harold stared, transfixed by the sight, he realized it wasn't the only one. Three more lights emerged from the darkness in a tight triangular formation, gliding silently just below the wing level. They were far too close for any other aircraft, yet there was no turbulence, no alarm from the cockpit, and no change in the plane's steady rhythm. Then came the hum, a low, deep vibration that felt as though it were originating from within his own chest rather than from the air around him. Harold looked around the cabin, desperate for a witness, but no one else stirred. Not the flight attendants in their jump seats, nor the other passengers buried under their thin blankets. It was as if time had congealed into a thick, inescapable syrup. The lights outside the window began to shift, bleeding into impossible gradients of red and violet that no human language could accurately describe. And then between the pulses of light, he saw it. A figure sat in the middle seat beside him, tall, unmoving, and draped in a presence that felt like a void in the air. The figure was expressionless, its skin smooth and pale like polished bone, and its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were vast obsidian pools that reflected no light from the cabin. It didn't turn to face him, nor did it make any sound, yet Harold felt a single word enter his mind as clearly as if it had been whispered directly into his ear. Observe. In that moment, the fear that had been clawing at his throat was replaced by a profound, crushing silence. He blinked, and in the space of a heartbeat, everything was back to normal. The cabin lights were at their standard dim setting, the passengers were snoring softly, and the flight attendants were moving through the aisle with their carts. The lights outside the window were gone, leaving only the empty, starlit sky. Harold reached for his book, but it was already closed, with a bookmark tucked into a page he hadn't yet reached. When the plane finally descended into the gray morning of Chicago, he disembarked in a daze, speaking to no one about the encounter. But the final shock came later, while he was waiting for his luggage. He checked the seat number on his boarding stub, comparing it to a diagram of the aircraft he had just left. Flight 815, according to the official records, had no row 33. The cabin ended at row 32, and there was no record of a seat 33A ever existing on that model of the jet. Chapter 3. In the winter of 1962, the world was a place defined by the biting cold of the mountains and the silent, invisible front lines of the Cold War. Deep in the snowy, windswept hills outside Great Falls, Montana, a small government communications site stood as a lonely sentinel on a desolate ridge. It was known simply as Tower 7, a skeletal finger of steel reaching toward the stars, with a low, cinder-block bunker at its base that hummed with the constant, rhythmic pulse of military precision. Staffed by only 2 men per shift, its purpose was basic but critical, relaying microwave signals between the hidden military installations that dotted the northern frontier. For most who worked there, the nights were defined by uneventful hours spent monitoring glowing green oscilloscopes and the smell of ozone and stale coffee. That winter, a technician named James Delaney was working the midnight shift alone. His partner had been reassigned unexpectedly, and until a replacement could be sent from the base, James was left to maintain the equipment solo in the absolute isolation of the ridge. The wind howled against the steel lattice of the tower, a mournful sound that usually provided a comforting backdrop to his work, but on his third night alone, the atmosphere in the bunker changed. Around 2:15 a.m., a low, precise tone began to seep through the primary receiver, not the chaotic interference of a solar storm or the garbled static of a distant radio station, but a steady, mathematical frequency that seemed to vibrate the very tools on his workbench. James checked the readouts, but the monitors showed no incoming signal from any authorized channel, and the tone didn't match any known military encryption. When he attempted to isolate the source, the entire console dimmed, the vacuum tubes glowing with a sickly orange light before plunging the room into near darkness. Then the tower lights above began to flicker in a rhythmic pattern that felt like a code. James grabbed his heavy wool coat and stepped outside into the freezing Montana wind, his boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. The air was perfectly still, devoid of the usual mountain gusts, yet it felt heavy and charged with a metallic static that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He looked up at the silhouette of Tower 7. Hovering exactly 30 feet above the spire was a matte black object, a disc-shaped void that blotted out the stars. It possessed no visible seams, no rivets, and no lights of its own. It was simply a featureless shadow that sat in the air with a terrifying, absolute silence. James stood motionless, his breath hitching in his throat, as the object remained perfectly still for nearly 2 minutes. Then, from its underside, a needle-thin beam of blood-red light extended, not onto the ground, but across the air, connecting directly to the top of the tower like a physical tether. The tone returned, louder now, not emanating from the equipment inside, but vibrating from the object itself. It hummed through the metal frame of the tower, through the frozen soil beneath his feet, and deep into the marrow of his bones. It was as if the tower were being used as a straw, the object drinking the data and frequency directly from the Earth systems. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the light snapped off. The disk tilted with a silent, impossible physics, turned without a sound, and disappeared into the night sky in a smooth horizontal blur that left no trail and no sonic boom. James rushed back inside to find the bunker in shambles. Every piece of sensitive equipment was dead, the backup systems refusing to engage despite his desperate attempts to restore power. When the technicians arrived the next day to investigate the blackout, they found something even more disturbing. Every magnetic recording tape from the previous 12 hours was completely blank. The tapes hadn't just been erased. They were physically altered, the magnetic coating rendered into a smooth, glassy film that held no charge. James filed a standard report, omitting the impossible details of the disk to protect his position, but he wasn't the only one who had felt the ridge that night. Several nights later, another technician refused to return for his shift, claiming he had heard a tone in the wind and felt like something was watching the tower from above. By spring, Tower 7 was quietly shut down, its cables cut and its equipment stripped. The structure still stands today, a rusting skeleton chapter full in the sweltering, humid heart of the Nebraska plains during the summer of 1994. The land seemed to hold a heavy, verdant secret. The cornfields didn't just grow. They dominated the landscape, standing like a vast, rustling army of green and gold that stretched to the very edge of the horizon. The air was thick and stagnant, scented with the smell of wet earth and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming harvest. It was a world defined by the rhythmic, deafening chorus of cicadas that thrived in the July heat, a sound that became so constant it eventually felt like a form of silence. In a secluded farmhouse miles from the nearest town, the Mills family lived by the pulse of the soil, unaware that the sky above was preparing a spectacle that would shatter their understanding of reality. 10-year-old Sarah Mills was a quiet child, possessing a tethered curiosity that often led her to wander the hidden paths between the corn stalks. She carried a tattered sketchbook and a handful of pencils, finding more comfort in the company of the wind and the birds than in the noise of the schoolyard. On a particularly humid Tuesday evening, just as the sun began to sink into a bruised horizon of molten orange and deep violet, Sarah wandered into the tall stalks behind the barn. She had noticed a trail of flattened corn that led deep into the field, a path that no tractor or animal had made. When the dinner bell rang at 6:30 p.m., Sarah didn't emerge from the green labyrinth. The silence that followed her absence was not the peaceful, evening quiet of the countryside, but a heavy, expectant hush that seemed to suppress even the sound of the crickets. Her older brother, Caleb, a teenager whose life revolved around chores and football, was the first to realize that something was fundamentally wrong. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and pushed through the rows, calling her name with a voice that grew increasingly frantic as the twilight deepened into a dark indigo. He reached a clearing near the center of the field, a perfect circle of crushed, blackened corn that looked as though it had been pressed down by the weight of a giant's palm. There, in the absolute center of the circle, Caleb found his sister. Sarah wasn't hiding or playing, she was suspended in the air. She was floating perfectly upright, 10 feet above the dry Nebraska dust, her arms resting at her sides as if she were standing on a floor made of glass. Her eyes were open, clear and calm, fixed on a point far beyond the clouds that no one else could see. Her hair drifted around her face as if she were submerged in water, and she seemed to be breathing in a slow, rhythmic cycle that matched the pulsing light of the craft above. Hovering directly above her with not a single inch of deviation was a seamless metallic orb. It was a polished, mercury-like silver, possessing no markings, no seams, and no visible engines. It reflected the fading sunset with a distorted, dreamlike clarity, its surface shimmering like a pool of liquid metal. It possessed no engines and made no sound, yet the air around it felt dense and charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Caleb's arms stand on end. As their parents and two neighbors arrived at the edge of the clearing, drawn by Caleb's cries, they stood in a state of paralyzed, prayerful awe. No one dared to step into the scorched circle, fearing they might disrupt whatever invisible tether was holding the girl. One witness, a seasoned farmer who had lived in the valley for 70 years, later described the scene as being too quiet, as if the craft had drawn all sound and light into itself. Sarah did not cry out, did not move, and showed no sign of distress. She seemed to be a part of the craft, or perhaps the craft was a part of her. Without a single flicker of light or a mechanical roar, the sphere began to ascend slowly, and Sarah followed, rising with a gentle, terrifying grace into the darkening sky. When she reached 20 feet above the corn, her body seemed to shimmer, her edges blurring into the twilight as if she were being translated into another language. Chapter 5. In the sweltering, airless summer of 1992, Thomas Miller moved into a sun-bleached adobe house on the jagged, sage-choked fringes of Espanola, New Mexico. It was a modest property, built from the very earth and straw it stood upon, isolated by miles of gray-green scrub and the heavy, ancient silence of the high desert night. The house felt as though it were part of the landscape itself, breathing with the heat of the day and exhaling the cool, dry air of the mountains after dusk. However, the property possessed one singular, unsettling anomaly. A small, windowless side room located off the main hallway, painted in a shade of blue so deep and unnatural it felt like staring into a physical bruise. The landlord had casually dismissed it as a simple storage nook, but to Thomas, the blue room felt like a void in the architecture of his life. The phenomena began not with a sound, but with a persistent, rhythmic disruption of sleep. Every night without fail, Thomas would find himself bolt upright in his old reading chair at exactly 3:33 a.m. There was no alarm, no noise to trigger the awakening, only a sudden, sharp clarity of mind and the sensation of a low-frequency hum vibrating through the soles of his feet. He began to notice that the blue room, despite the sweltering New Mexico midnights where the desert floor held the day's fire, remained consistently 15 degrees colder than the rest of the house. The air inside that room felt dense, as if the molecules were packed too tightly, and on certain mornings the deep blue walls would sweat a moisture that smelled of ozone and scorched earth, though no leaks were ever discovered. His dreams became vivid and cinematic, filled with a voice whispering strings of numbers and images of a slow-turning object suspended in an infinite, silent distance. Desperate for an explanation, Thomas began to experiment with the room's hidden nature. One night, he placed a high-end portable cassette recorder on a small wooden table in the center of the blue space and left it running while he retreated to the living room. The tape captured 6 hours of absolute dead silence until the digital clock on the mantel hit 3:33 a.m. At that precise second, the white noise on the tape dipped into a hollow vacuum, followed by a series of rhythmic mechanical clicks like a series of heavy switches being thrown deep within the foundations of the earth. The next morning, he found the chair in the room was facing the opposite direction, though the door had been locked from the outside. He thought he was losing his mind until the neighbors mentioned that the house had been vacant for nearly a decade because every previous tenant had fled within months, some without even bothering to collect their security deposits. They spoke of bad dreams and things that show up in mirrors, but Thomas was already too deep into the mystery to leave. He began to feel watched, not in the bedroom or the kitchen, but only when he stood near the threshold of that windowless blue void. On his final night in the house, unable to sleep, Thomas decided to confront the room. He sat in the chair with the door cracked just enough to let in a sliver of light from the hallway, his flashlight gripped in a trembling hand. He turned off all the lights and waited. As the minute hand clicked to 3:33, the room filled with an unnatural glow that didn't come from any bulb or the world outside. It was a pale, shifting light that seemed to leak in from a place behind the walls. For the briefest moment, the village of Akatuk did not just lose its people. It lost the very sound of life in the brutal winter of 1953. Nestled on the jagged western coast of Alaska, it was a close-knit community of fewer than 50 souls, a place of quiet fishing boats and wide, frozen skies where the Inuit families lived by the rhythm of the tides and the migration of the caribou. Raymond Cross, a bush pilot with ice in his veins and 5 years of experience flying supply routes into the interior, was banking his twin-engine plane over the inlet just as a storm front began to roll in from the Bering Sea. From the air, the village looked intact, its wooden houses huddled together against the wind. But as Raymond spiraled down for his landing, he noticed the first sign of a deeper wrongness. There was no smoke curling from the stone chimneys, a death sentence in a place where the temperature had plunged to 40 below zero. When his skis finally touched the hard-packed snow of the inlet, the only sound was the dying, metallic groan of his own engines. Raymond stepped out into the biting wind, his hand resting on his holster, and called out to the families he had known for years. There was no response, not even the defensive, territorial bark of a sled dog. He walked up the main path, his boots crunching in the fresh, undisturbed snow. He found the doors to the houses standing wide open, inviting the frost inside. In one home, a stew sat in a cast-iron pot over a fire pit that had long since turned to gray ash. In another, clothing hung on lines, frozen stiff as boards in the gale. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood on the white ground, and most terrifyingly, no footprints leading away from the village into the vast, white wilderness. Seeking a radio to call for help, Raymond entered the village schoolhouse, a small, one-room building that served as the heart of the community. What he found inside would haunt his waking hours until his final day. Every chair in the room had been moved from the desks and arranged in the center of the floor, forming a perfect, tightening spiral. On the chalkboard, a complex diagram of circles, lines, and dots had been drawn with such frantic intensity that the chalk had snapped mid-stroke, leaving a jagged white mark that felt like a scream. As he stood in the freezing silence of the schoolroom, his own portable radio began to pulse with a rhythmic, garbled feedback, not static, but a sound that resembled a heavy, metallic lung breathing in the dark. Raymond stayed for less than an hour, the mounting dread making it impossible to remain. He flew straight to Nome and filed a report, returning days later with a team of state authorities. By then, fresh snow had covered most of the village, further erasing whatever secrets it held. No bodies were ever discovered, no sign of an organized evacuation was found, and no tracks leading away into the wilderness were ever identified. The government officially wrote it off as a freak migration event or an unreported emergency caused by unstable ice, but Raymond knew the truth lay in the silence of that schoolroom. In his later years, he spoke of that afternoon only once, describing the air in Akatuk not as empty, but as watched, as if he had been standing on a stage with a great, unseen curtain just beginning to lift. The village remains abandoned to this day, a cluster of rotting wood and bone where the wind carries the faint, impossible sound of footsteps that never quite reach the door. Chapter 7. In the damp emerald twilight of 1982, the glacial waters of Echo Lake, Washington, remain one of the most isolated pockets of the Pacific Northwest. Surrounded by towering ridges of cedar, hemlock, and ancient Douglas firs that kept the water still even in the fiercest mountain storms, the lake was a dark mirror to the heavens. It was a place where the fog didn't just drift. It seemed to emerge from the water itself, wrapping the shoreline in a heavy, cold shroud that smelled of wet pine needles and minerals. David Vance, a seasonal ranger with a background in military navigation and a preference for the profound silence of the high timber, was stationed on the eastern bank to repair a perimeter fence that had been torn down by unknown forces. The air was thick and vibrant with the sounds of the wilderness, but there was an underlying tension that David could feel in his marrow. As a crescent moon began its slow ascent over the jagged peaks, David sat by his small campfire, sipping a cup of strong coffee. The night was unusually clear, providing perfect visibility across the glassy surface of the lake. It was then that he noticed something impossible. A pale, bioluminescent glow was emanating from deep beneath the water, right at the center of the lake. At first, he assumed it was a trick of the moonlight or a reflection from a distant peak, but the light moved with a fluid, calculated grace, slicing against the direction of the underlying current. As he watched from the small wooden dock, his heart thudding against his ribs, the glow split into icky, distinct orbs. They were round, dim, and began to rotate around one another like twin stars caught in a private, gravitational orbit. David stood and walked to the very edge of the wood, his .35 camera gripped in a trembling hand. The lights rose higher through the black water, casting a faint, shimmering violet and white hue on the submerged rocks at his feet. They moved with a silent, mechanical precision that possessed no sound of engines, no splashes, and no displacement. Suddenly, a third light erupted from the center of the rotation, a concentrated, brilliant beam that shot directly upward from the water's surface, piercing the mountain fog like a white-hot needle. David described the sensation not as a sound, but as a crushing pressure in the air, as if the very atmosphere around him had thickened into a heavy, static-charged gelatin. He didn't feel fear, but rather a deep-rooted, primal instinct to remain motionless, as if any movement would draw the attention of a predator from another world. The lights accelerated their spinning, becoming a blinding blur of white before they blinked out all at once, plunging the lake back into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical blow. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the lights. The forest was dead quiet, as if every living creature had fled the area. The following morning, David found no physical disturbance on the bank, but when he went to develop the film from his camera, every frame taken during the encounter was found. The stretch of Route 17 in upstate New York during the autumn of 1979 was a ribbon of asphalt cutting through a landscape that felt as though it were slowly being reclaimed by the wild. It was an era of heavy, steel-framed trucks and the scent of leaded gasoline, where the dense forests of the Catskills held onto a damp, cloying chill long after the sun had set. In October, the late-night fog didn't just drift. It sat heavy on the road, turning the beams of the few passing vehicles into opaque, yellow tunnels of light. Michael and Leon, icky highway maintenance workers with decades of collective experience, were tasked with clearing the debris from a midnight storm that had battered the region. Their truck rumbled with a rhythmic, mechanical growl, its orange warning lights flickering against the black trunks of the towering oaks and maples that lined the shoulder. Around 1:30 a.m., just as they approached a desolate curve known for its lack of radio reception, Leon noticed something standing on the gravel. He signaled Michael to slow down, thinking it might be a stranded motorist or a piece of industrial wreckage. But as the truck's headlights swept over the object, it didn't reflect the light in the way metal or plastic should. Standing perfectly vertical in the grit was a towering pane of glass, nearly 7 feet tall and several feet wide, without a single frame, stand, or support to hold it against the wind. It stood with a terrifying, impossible poise, a singular object that felt like an intrusion into the physical world, a mirror that had no business being in the middle of a New York forest. They stepped out of the truck, the smell of wet leaves and ozone thick in the air. Michael walked toward the pane, but as he moved in front of it, he realized the first profound oddity. The glass didn't show his reflection. It didn't show the headlights of the idling truck or the gravel at his feet. Instead, the mirror showed a different version of Route 17. In the world behind the glass, the road didn't stretch straight into the darkness. It curved sharply into a thick, vibrant grove of black pines, trees that didn't exist in the physical woods surrounding them. The air inside that reflection looked heavy with a gray, swirling fog, and the stars in that other sky were arranged in constellations that Michael did not recognize. As they hem-stared, transfixed by the impossible window, shapes began to move within the reflected pines. Tall, thin silhouettes, elongated like shadows cast by a dying fire, began to walk slowly along the edge of the false highway. They had no visible faces, no clothing, and no light of their own. They were merely voids moving through the fog, pausing occasionally as if they could hear the heartbeats of the men on the other side of the glass. Leon, driven by a hypnotic curiosity he would later be unable to explain, reached out his hand and touched the surface. He described it not as cold glass, but as a surface with no temperature at all, a vibrating lack of sensation that seemed to draw the warmth directly from his skin. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing tone erupted from the glass, a sound like a razor being scraped across a massive iron bell. The shapes in the reflection turned in unison, their featureless heads tilting toward the men as if they had finally pinpointed their location. Michael's blood ran cold when he looked at Leon's reflection. His partner wasn't standing beside him in the glass anymore. Leon's reflection was already several yards deep in Chapter 9. The Blue Ridge Mountains of Georgia in the summer of 1984 were a world of emerald heat and suffocating humidity, where the air felt as thick as the legends that clung to its ridges. Emily and Theo, ICI graduate students conducting a long-term biodiversity survey for the state's forestry department, had set up their camp on a remote, unmapped ridge far from the well-trodden Appalachian Trail. Their days were filled with the meticulous cataloging of bird calls and the collection of soil samples, their nights spent around a small, crackling fire with the comfort of a battery-operated radio. It was a world of analog certainty, until their third evening on the mountain, when the natural laws of the forest seemed to suspend themselves. As the sun dipped behind the western peaks, leaving the sky a bruised violet, a silence fell across the valley that was so absolute it was terrifying. The insects, which usually created a deafening roar in the July heat, fell silent in an instant. The birds ceased their calls, and even the wind, which usually rustled through the thick oak and pine leaves, dropped to a dead halt. The air felt dense and compressed, as if the oxygen had been replaced by a heavy, static-charged gelatin. Theo pointed toward the ridge line directly above their camp, where Oos figures stood silhouetted against the last of the light. At first, they thought they were other hikers, perhaps lost or seeking a campsite. But as the minutes passed, the figures remained perfectly still, their arms at their sides, facing directly down toward the camp with a predatory focus. Through their binoculars, Emily saw a detail that made her stomach drop. The figures were nearly 8 feet tall, their limbs elongated and skeletal, and their heads were completely smooth. They had no eyes, no noses, and no mouths, only pale, bare skin that seemed to shimmer with a faint, internal luminescence. They were not watching with eyes, but with a presence that Emily felt reaching beneath her very thoughts. They stood motionless for hours, a silent vigil that defied human reason. Around 2:00 a.m., the campfire began to dim, the flames struggling to rise as if the light itself were being siphoned away by the darkness above. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate inside the researchers' skulls, a sound that bypassed their ears and caused a mounting pressure behind NRIs. Then the figures began to move. They didn't walk, they slid. They descended the steep, rocky ridge in a perfectly straight line, NR bodies motionless and upright, moving with an effortless grace that ignored the rugged terrain. Theo, overcome by a primal instinct to break the silence, grabbed a magnesium flare and fired it into the sky. The blinding red light of the flare illuminated the valley for a few brief seconds, and in that instant the figures froze. Then, as if they were made of nothing more than mist, they vanished entirely before the light had even faded. The next morning, the forest returned to life with an aggressive intensity, but the researchers found NR camp changed. The trees surrounding NR tent were scorched in narrow, vertical lines as if they had been exposed to a concentrated beam of heat from above. NR satellite phone, which had failed during the encounter, was now operational, but NR recordings of the week had been replaced by the same low, rhythmic hum they had felt in NR heads. Emily later described Chapter 10, The Cornfields of Rural Iowa in September 1977, were an endless sea of swaying, golden stalks, a landscape so vast and uniform that it seemed to dictate the very rhythm of life for those who lived within it. For the Miller family, the harvest was more than just a season. It was a grueling, sun-drenched marathon of labor that measured the worth of a man by the calluses on his hands and the endurance of his spirit. Jacob, the family patriarch, was a man carved from the very soil he tended, quiet, methodical, and deeply rooted in the physical reality of his machinery and his crops. He believed in the predictable cycle of the seasons, the certainty of the sunrise, and the hard-earned silence of a day well spent. But on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, the fundamental laws of his world were quietly and irrevocably dismantled. It began at daybreak, just as the first sliver of light began to peel back the heavy velvet of the prairie night. Silas, the youngest son, stepped onto the wraparound porch to begin his morning chores, but he stopped mid-stride, his hand hovering over the railing. The world had gone mute. The usual dawn chorus of birds, the frantic chirping of sparrows, and the distant call of a hawk was missing. Even the crickets, which usually provided a vibrating backdrop to the Iowa heat, had vanished into an unnatural void. The wind, which almost always rustled through the millions of corn stalks like a soft, dry tide, had simply ceased to exist. The air was stagnant, heavy, and carried a weight that made it feel as though the oxygen itself had been replaced by something denser. In the barn, Jacob was preparing his tools for the day's harvest, his mind occupied with the tension of a broken belt on the combine. Suddenly, a light began to seep through the cracks in the weathered barn rafters. It wasn't the warm, yellow glow of the rising sun. It was a pulsing, ethereal blue light, the color of moonlight trapped beneath deep water. It poured across the straw-covered floor, illuminating the dust motes with a shimmering brilliance that felt cold to the touch. The horses didn't whinny or kick at their stalls. They fell into an immediate catatonic trance, their breath suspended in the air, their eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the sapphire glow like polished glass. Jacob walked out into the yard, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name, and his scythe slipped from his fingers, clattering silently onto the dust. Floating exactly 15 feet above his prize, northern cornfield was an object that defied every principle of aviation and physics Jacob understood. It was a massive, oval-shaped craft, dark as obsidian at its center, surrounded by two slow-turning rings of pale, liquid light that shimmered and flowed like molten glass. It possessed no visible seams, no rivets, and no engines, yet it resonated with a presence that seemed to vibrate the very earth beneath his boots. As Silas watched from the porch, terrified and unable to call out, he realized that the world around his father was beginning to warp. Time itself seemed to stretch and thicken. Silas saw his father reach out a hand toward the craft, but the movement was agonizingly slow, as if Jacob were trying to swim through a pool of thick, invisible syrup. A single drop of sweat on Jacob's forehead broke and began to roll down his cheek, only to pause and hang suspended in midair, a tiny, glistening pearl of salt water held in place by a localized suspension of gravity. The dust in the yard, kicked up by the morning breeze that was no longer there, hung motionless in the air like a photograph of a storm. Inside the farmhouse, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock ceased, and the very ground began to hum with a low, tremulous resonance that felt like the groaning of a vast, ancient machine waking up deep beneath the topsoil. The cornstalks directly beneath the craft didn't sway or rustle. They were pushed outward in a perfect, geometric circle by a force that exerted a crushing pressure Silas could feel even from 50 yards away. The stalks were flattened with such precision that they formed a spiral pattern, laid down as if by the hand of a master architect. And then, as suddenly as a candle being snuffed out in a gale, the object vanished. The blue glow disappeared, the wind rushed back into the void with a sudden, violent gust that nearly knocked Silas off his feet, and the birds began to scream in a frantic, disjointed chorus of alarm. All the clocks in the house ticked forward in unison, revealing that exactly 3 minutes had been lost to the ether, 3 minutes that Silas would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. But the most profound change was in Jacob. He walked back to the house with a slow, mechanical gait, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the horizon. Chapter 11 on the jagged, salt-sprayed cliffs of the Maine coast, where the Atlantic's fury is a constant, rhythmic roar against the stone, the lighthouse at Black Rock stood as a lonely, stubborn sentinel. It was a place of isolation and duty, a tower of light built to guide the lost through the treacherous, fog-choked waters of the north. In the late summer of 1975, the keeper of the light was a man named Harrison Reed, a veteran of the sea who had spent most of his adult life seeking the absolute solitude of the coast. Harrison was a man defined by a rigid, almost religious adherence to routine. His life was captured in the pages of a massive, leather-bound logbook where every barometric dip, every shift in wind direction, and every swelling wave was recorded by hand with a fountain pen. To him, these entries were his only anchor to reality, a way to prove that time was moving in a straight, logical line. The morning of August 2nd began with a humidity so thick it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. Just after dawn, as the first gray light began to bleed into the horizon, Harrison noticed something unusual moving in from the deep water. It wasn't the standard gray, salt-heavy mist common to the Maine coast. It was a massive fog bank that shimmered with a rusted, milky red hue, glowing with an internal light that seemed to pulse like a slow-beating heart. It didn't drift with the breeze. It moved in a perfectly straight, calculated line, slicing across the white caps as if it were being guided by an unseen hand. As the fog rolled over the cliffs and engulfed the lighthouse tower, the world outside the lantern room's glass vanished into an opaque, crimson void. Sound, which usually carried for miles across the water, became unnaturally muffled, as if the entire tower had been encased in layers of heavy, damp wool. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocks below fell into a deathly, absolute silence. Inside the keeper's room, the electronics began to fail in a series of erratic glitches. Harrison's primary VHF radio hissed with a frantic static that slowly coalesced into a low, rhythmic pulsing, a sound that felt less like electrical interference and more like a heavy, metallic heartbeat echoing from the fog. Then came the voices. They weren't screams or shouts, but calm, conversational whispers that seemed to emerge from the very air of the room, speaking a language that sounded like a fractured, ancient version of his own. A male voice, distant and echoing as if through a long, metallic tunnel, began to repeat a series of coordinates and names that Harrison had never heard before. As he stood in the center of the room, paralyzed by a mounting dread, he saw lights beginning to move through the red mist outside the glass. They were soft, cold glows of blue and white, drifting with the fluid grace of bioluminescent creatures in the deepest reaches of the ocean. They blinked in complex mathematical patterns that seemed to be communicating with the lighthouse itself, or perhaps with something beneath it. Harrison reached for his logbook to record the anomaly, but his fingers felt numb, and the pen felt as heavy as a lead pipe. He watched as the fog began to seep through the sealed windows, a fine reddish dust that smelled of ozone and ancient, drying sea salt. When the red fog finally recoiled back toward the sea, as suddenly and inexplicably as it had arrived, the world returned with a violent, deafening rush of sound. The waves roared, the gulls screamed, and the radio burst into a cacophony of normal maritime traffic. Harrison rushed outside, his heart hammering in his chest, to find 3 wide, circular impressions burned into the tough cliffside grass at the base of the tower. They were perfectly spaced, forming an equilateral triangle, and the grass within them had been rendered into a fine, gray ash. There were no tracks leading to or from the site, no smell of fuel, and no sign of any physical craft. but the true terror awaited him back at his desk. He sat down to record the experience, his hands still trembling, but the logbook was already open. Beside his chair, a single page had been torn from the book and placed neatly on the blotter. The handwriting was undeniably his own. Every loop and slant of the letters was a perfect match for his hand, but the ink felt strangely watery and cold to the touch. At the top of the page, the date was written in his familiar scrawl, August 3rd, 1975. It was a full 24 hours in the future. The entry described the arrival of the red fog, the rhythmic pulsing of the radio. Chapter 12. In the blistering, sun-cracked silence of the Mojave Desert in the summer of 1981, the landscape felt like a place where time had been forgotten. It was a world of red sand, ancient rock formations, and a heat so intense it seemed to vibrate the very horizon. Dr. Alina Vance, a university geologist with a preference for the absolute solitude of the wilderness, had set up her small survey camp at the edge of a dry, prehistoric plateau. She was a woman of logic and science, believing that the layers of sediment and the crystalline structures of the rock held the only true history of the earth. Her nights were spent in a small canvas tent, surrounded by the analog tools of her trade, magnetic compasses, a theodolite, and a heavy, reel-to-reel audio recorder for logging her daily observations. The solitude was something she usually welcomed, but on her third night in the desert, the silence of the plateau was broken by a sound that made her blood run cold. At exactly 2:41 a.m., Alina was jolted awake by three soft, rising whistles. They weren't the erratic calls of a bird or the wind whistling through the narrow canyons. Each note was surgically clear, distinct, and separated by a haunting, calculated silence. She sat up in her cot, her breath hitching in her throat, listening as the final note seemed to linger in the stagnant air of the tent. No animal in the Mojave made a sound like that. It was a tone that felt engineered, a sequence that carried the weight of a deliberate signal. The pattern repeated the following night at the exact same minute. At 2:41 a.m., the whistles returned, only this time they felt significantly closer, as if the source were standing just beyond the perimeter of her campfire's dying embers. Determined to find a logical explanation, Alina began to monitor her equipment as the hour approached on the third night. But as the clock neared 2:41, her technological world began to disintegrate. Her primary magnetic compass began to spin in frantic, meaningless circles, its needle twitching as if caught in a powerful, localized magnetic vortex. Her handheld radio, which had been silent for days, began to emit a high-pitched harmonic frequency that made her ears ring and her nose begin to bleed. Looking out through the tent flap toward the jagged ridges of the plateau, she saw blue flashes of light pulsing through the dark, silent, rhythmic flickers that looked like Morse code being sent from the very heavens, yet there was no thunder and no storm in the cloudless sky. On her final night, the whistles didn't come from the distance. They were right outside the thin canvas of her tent. The three short notes were so loud they felt like a physical pressure against her skull, followed by an absolute silence that seemed to suck the very air out of the camp. Terrified, Alina gripped her flashlight and unzipped the flap, expecting to find a person or a craft. Instead, she found the clearing bathed in a pale, ethereal blue light that had no visible source. The ground around her tent, which had been smooth and undisturbed the evening before, was now covered in perfect, geometric rings pressed into the hard-packed sand. They weren't footprints. They were deep, circular indentations spaced with a diagrammatic precision that looked like a celestial map carved into the earth. When she returned to the safety of the university days later and played back the audio recorder she had left running, she found something that would ensure she never returned to the desert again. Amid the hiss of the desert wind and the rhythmic static of the electronic interference, there was a segment where the static dipped into a hollow silence. In that silence, her own voice, distorted, layered, and sounding as if it were being played at the wrong speed, whispered a message she had no memory of ever speaking into the microphone. Follow the tone you've already seen. Chapter 13, the summer of 1993, did not just bring heat to the Atchafalaya Basin of Louisiana. It brought a heavy, stagnant weight that seemed to press the very breath out of the lungs. The air was a thick, humid soup, scented with the cloying sweetness of blooming jasmine and the sharp, visceral tang of rot and swamp mud. In this world of shadows and slow-moving water, Silas Beaumont lived in a sagging wooden shack that felt more like a part of the cypress grove than a human habitation. Silas was a man sculpted by the river, a retired ferryman who had spent 40 years guiding strangers and neighbors alike across the black, lightless veins of the basin. Now in the twilight of his years, the ferry had long since succumbed to the silt and the moss, but Silas remained, a lonely sentinel in a land that was slowly reclaiming everything he had ever known. Silas suffered from a chronic, gnawing insomnia that made the nights feel like endless, echoing chambers. To stave off the crushing silence of the bayou, he kept a small, battery-operated cassette recorder by his bedside. He would speak into it late at night, his voice a gravelly murmur as he narrated old Cajun folk tales, or simply described the rhythmic, violent thunderstorms that would frequently tear across the southern sky. He found a peculiar comfort in the mechanical whirl of the tape and the soft click of the buttons. It was a tangible proof that time was still moving forward in a place where the sun and the moon seemed to stand still. He never intended for anyone to hear these recordings. They were merely anchors for a mind that was beginning to feel as untethered as the drifting duckweed on the water. One humid morning, following a night of particularly aggressive rainfall that had turned the swamp into a cacophony of thunder and splashing water, Silas sat on his porch to review his latest recording. As the tape hissed through the player, he heard the familiar sound of the rain hitting his tin roof and the distant groan of the cypress trees. But at exactly 3:13 a.m. on the counter, the recording changed. The ambient noise of the storm didn't fade, but it was joined by a sound that made the hair on Silas's arms stand in jagged lines. It was a voice, not his own, and not quite human. It was a raspy, hollow whisper that felt as though it had been pulled through a sieve of river sand and ancient, sunken wood. "Take them across," the voice murmured, the tone flat, devoid of any pleading or malice, existing as a singular, chilling command. Silas froze, the tape continuing to hiss in the heavy silence of his porch. He replayed the segment a dozen times, his trembling fingers fumbling with the plastic buttons. Each time the words were the same, but the sensation of hearing them grew more suffocating. Desperate for a logical explanation, he began to dig through his box of old tapes, some recorded months prior. To his horror, he found the same haunting phrase hidden beneath the static of multiple recordings. In some, the voice was accompanied by the rhythmic, metallic clink of chains and the sound of something vast and heavy shifting in the dark water beneath his dock. On the final night he would ever spend in the basin, Silas placed the recorder on the rotting wood of the ferry landing, determined to capture the source of the intruders. He retreated to his shack, locking the door and clutching an old shotgun he hadn't fired in years. In the morning, he found the recorder sitting exactly where he had left it, but the tape had stopped mid-spool despite the batteries being brand new. The final 3 minutes were a symphony of visceral terror. The sound of wet, bare feet stepping slowly onto the porch, a rope tightening with a heavy, groaning strain that sounded like the dock itself was being pulled into the abyss, and a low, rhythmic humming like a lullaby being sung by something that didn't need lungs to breathe. When Silas finally gathered the courage to step outside, he found a single set of footprints, small, wet, and human-like but far too narrow, leading from the water directly to his bedroom window and then back into the black depths of the river. There was no trail coming out of the swamp, only the one leading in. He packed his bags by noon and fled the basin, leaving behind the house and the tapes, but carrying the note he had found pinned to his door with a rough. Chapter 14, the Willamette Valley of Oregon in the autumn of 1974, was a place of emerald-hued mist, and a silence so profound it felt as though the world had forgotten the existence of noise. For Thomas Brewer, the valley was more than a home. It was a legacy etched into the very soil he tended. He was a man of the seasons, overseeing a small, ancestral apple orchard that had been planted by his grandfather's grandfather. The trees were ancient, gnarled behemoths with bark as thick as iron and limbs that curled like the skeletal hands of giants reaching for the perpetually overcast sky. Each fall, the orchard would surrender its heavy, sweet fruit in a slow, rhythmic tide of red and gold, a cycle Thomas had trusted for his entire 60 years. But that October, the mist didn't just drift. It arrived in thick, pearled layers that felt heavy enough to drown the trees. It smelled of fermented apples, ozone, and a coldness that didn't belong to the Pacific Northwest. On a Tuesday night, compelled by a sudden, jagged restlessness, Thomas rose before the first light of dawn to check on the northern fence line. It was there, amidst the swirling white veil, that he saw the first sign of the intruders. Three pale sapphire orbs, no larger than lanterns, were floating silently between the long, shadowed rows of trees. They didn't flicker like fireflies, nor did they cast any shadows on the damp grass below. They moved with a calculated, predatory intelligence, weaving through the branches as if they were performing a ritual older than the orchard itself. Thomas watched from behind a thick oak trunk, his breath hitching in his throat. He blinked, rubbing his eyes against the biting chill, and in that second, the sapphire lights vanished as if they had been snuffed out by a cosmic hand. The following morning, the orchard felt fundamentally altered. His loyal dog, a creature that had faced down wolves and coyotes without a flinch, refused to set foot in the northern rows, his hackles raised and a low, guttural whine vibrating in his chest. His young grandson Owen, who was visiting for the harvest, spoke of hearing whispers in the leaves and seeing men made of blue glass standing among the Gravensteins. Thomas tried to dismiss it as the overactive imagination of a child, but the secret weight of the orchard was beginning to crush his own resolve. Every night thereafter, the three lights returned, appearing with a surgical precision just before the first hint of gray touched the horizon. Thomas began to mark their movements in a small, weathered notebook, realizing with a mounting dread that they never passed beyond a specific, ancient row of trees, the original saplings planted over a century ago. One morning, beneath the oldest tree in that row, a hollowed-out behemoth with bark that felt like scorched stone, Thomas found a sight that shattered his logic. Hundreds of fallen apples had been gathered from the ground and arranged in a perfect, tightening spiral. They hadn't been dropped or rolled, they had been placed with a mathematical exactness that no human hand could achieve in the dark. At the absolute center of the spiral lay a handful of leaves that were burned and brittle, as if they had been touched by a localized high-intensity fire, yet the surrounding grass was pristine and heavy with the morning dew. When Thomas tried to take a photograph of the arrangement with his old Polaroid, the film emerged as a series of blank, white frames, not corrupted by light lakes, but as if the camera had been pointed directly into the center of a sun. The silence of the orchard grew more oppressive, the air becoming thick with a static charge that made Thomas's skin hum and his ears pop. On the final night of the visitation, Thomas followed the lights further than he had ever dared to walk after dark. He watched as the three sapphire orbs converged at the center of the spiral row, pulsing with a brilliance that turned the fog into a sea of electric blue. Without a single sound, the lights shot vertically into the heavens, vanishing into the clouds in a heartbeat and leaving a void in the sky that seemed to ache. He returned to his house to find all the clocks frozen at exactly 4:17 a.m. His dog was missing, leaving only a broken chain and a lingering scent of burnt air. When the new owners of the property eventually cleared the ancient row a year later, they found a hollow pocket in the earth lined with melted sand and fragments of translucent glass. Chapter 15, The Wilderness of Western Montana, is a realm defined by its unforgiving, majestic silence, a place where the jagged granite peaks and the dense, lightless forests of pine and hemlock keep their secrets behind a wall of absolute isolation. Tucked deep within these ridges, far from the nearest forest road or hiking trail, lies a body of water the locals call Mirror Lake. It is fed by the cold, pure runoff of ancient glaciers and surrounded by cliffs that block even the fiercest mountain winds, leaving the water's surface so preternaturally still it looks like a sheet of obsidian glass. In the airless, sweltering summer of 1993, Dana Reyes was stationed at the lake as a seasonal ranger, tasked with monitoring the environmental impact of the glacial retreat. Dana was a woman who sought the isolation of the backcountry to escape the clutter and noise of the modern world. Having served in the military, she found peace in the predictable, harsh laws of the wilderness and the meditative silence of the high timber. Her days were spent in a rhythmic routine of trail maintenance and map updates, her nights in a small, sturdy cabin that overlooked the glassy expanse of the lake. But during her second week at the station, the silence began to feel less like a comfort and more like a predatory presence. It was a silence that seemed to listen back. The anomaly began on her fifth night. While standing on the small wooden dock to perform her nightly radio check-in, Dana cleared her throat to speak into the mic. The echo that returned from across the lake was delayed by nearly 10 seconds, and it was subtly, terrifyingly wrong. The sound that came back was several octaves deeper than her own voice, slightly stretched and distorted, as if the forest were struggling to mimic the shape of her sound rather than simply reflecting it. She made a clinical note of the auditory glitch in her logbook, assuming it was a strange atmospheric inversion caused by the summer heat. But the following evening, the echo didn't come from the surrounding trees. It bubbled up from the lightless, freezing depths of the lake center. Each time Dana made a sound, a faint, garbled reply would ripple across the water's surface. It was a visceral, unsettling sensation, like hearing someone trying to speak through a thick pane of submerged glass. Driven by a mounting, irrational dread, she walked to the very edge of the dock and stared down into the black water. Her reflection stared back, but as she watched, she realized that the stars reflected in the water weren't the stars in the sky. They were arranged in unfamiliar, swirling patterns, vast celestial diagrams that didn't match the constellations of the northern hemisphere. And then, the reflection did something that Sarah's mind could barely process. It smiled. It was a slow, predatory expression that reached eyes she no longer recognized as her own, even as Dana's own face remained frozen in a mask of absolute terror. At exactly 2:07 a.m. on her final night, the absolute stillness of Mirror Lake was shattered. A perfect concentric circle of ripples formed in the center of the water, and the surface began to bulge upward as if something massive, silent, and ancient were breathing just beneath the skin of the lake. Dana scrambled back to the cabin, her hands trembling so violently she could barely key the radio. She called for the district office, desperate for the sound of a human voice, but the transmission was cut by a frantic buzz of static. In the silence that followed, a voice crackled through the speaker. It was her own voice, identical in every inflection and tone, but it spoke with a chilling, mechanical precision. "Mirror Lake Station 9, the voice said. "This is Dana Reyes. You're already inside, the reflection is all that's left." The radio went dead, and the cabin was plunged into a silence so heavy it felt as though the mountains themselves were pressing down on the roof. Dana never transmitted again. When a search team finally reached the station weeks later, they found the cabin clean and undisturbed, with Dana's logbook open to the final page and her gear neatly stowed. Her boots were found sitting at the very end of the dock, perfectly aligned as if she had simply stepped out of them and walked into the air. No footprints were ever found in the mud, and no trace of